Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Captain's Holiday, which is episode 19 of season 3 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation one episode at a time. In this video I cover the episode Captain's Holiday. So Captain's Holiday is the episode where Riker and the crew deem that Picard needs a vacation, and they have to practically shove him off the ship in order to get him to go on vacation to a resort planet called Risa, where he just goes to relax, but is somehow ensnared into a scheme that a shady archaeologist has and hiding a futuristic device from a shady Ferengi who is trying to steal the device from her. And so she and Picard spark a little romance and go off on an adventure to find this device, which happens to be from the future. And there are some aliens who are coming from the future to try to retrieve this device. And when Vash pretends that she doesn't know where the device is and it's lost, Picard figures out that she was in fact hiding it from them the whole time, that she had already retrieved it. And when she shows it to them, the aliens show up to take the device, and Picard questions if they are legitimately the owners of the device, or if they're not the criminals trying to steal it, as it's said to be able to destroy a star. But instead of proving their worth, they try to attack Picard, so Picard then promptly destroys the device, and then Vash and Picard part ways, and Picard returns to the Enterprise fully rested. So, so I have to tell the story that I just saw on the Next Generation Blu-rays about this episode, because I think it's a fascinating story on how this episode came to be. Now, apparently, this was written by Ira Steven Behr, and this is the only episode he got to have a full writing credit on this season, and that's part of what he said that he was disappointed in season 3, and part of why he left is because this was the only time he actually got to write an actual episode. Most of the time he was just working with the other writers and rewriting episodes and sort of gathering, building, constructing the outlines and whatnot, and was usually too busy doing that because, yes, the writing process in season 3 was very hectic. So he had an idea to write an episode about where Picard visits a vacation planet, a resort planet, and there he finds like a holodeck program that is able to produce one's biggest fears. So therefore you can go in it and confront your biggest fears kind of as an adventure. And when he goes into the program, he finds that it's a program of a future where Riker's the captain of the Enterprise and he's an admiral. So saying that his biggest fear is becoming an admiral, becoming sidelined and growing old, and that's what he fears. And thus it was meant to be a character piece where he confronted his fears of growing old and what it would be like to be an admiral. Now, he took this idea to fellow writer Ronald D. Moore, who loved the idea. So Ronald D. Moore helped him flesh it out. They've, came up with the whole outline of the episode, and they were very excited about it. Then they took it to Michael Piller. Michael Piller also loved it, thought it was a great character piece, and they wrote a script for it, and they were really excited for it. Until Rick Berman told Ira Steven Behr that he had to go meet with Gene Roddenberry, that Gene was requesting to meet with him. And so when Ira Steven Behr went to meet with Gene Roddenberry told him, "This episode is dead. It's not going to happen. because Picard would not fear growing old. That he's in the 21st century, he's perfectly okay with growing old, and we're not going to have an episode where Picard is afraid of becoming an admiral. He'd be fine with being an admiral. And apparently, from Ira Steven Behr's retelling of the events, Gene Roddenberry insisted that Picard is John Wayne, and John Wayne is not scared. Now, Ira Steven Behr, being a huge John Wayne fan, argued with Gene, saying, no, I know John Wayne, and John Wayne had plenty of movies, plenty of performances where he was scared and where he did have to confront his fears. And Gene Roddenberry simply said, well, that's not the John Wayne we're portraying. We're portraying the badass John Wayne who's not scared of anything. So, yeah. So he had to scrap the idea. But Roddenberry said, but I like the idea of a resort planet. Let's do that. And I've told this story before from this other perspective that I didn't know about the original script idea, but I told the story before from the idea that Roddenberry was wanting all sorts of sex and orgies and whatnot in the background, like implied, not seen, obviously, because they know they had to show it on TV. It would just be, a group sort of kissing and whatnot, and all sort of same-sex couples and everything like that. And which, remind you, this is the late 80s where unfortunately the networks would never allow it to air, which again sucks. I mean, maybe they would, but if they imply it in a very sort of orgies and stuff, then yeah, that was a bit over the top. And so he goes to Rick Berman. He's like, what the hell is Gene talking about? Talking about orgies and all this. And Rick Berman was like, just ignore that and just write a lighthearted episode where the captain gets laid. Which is what he did. And so he and the writing staff were extremely disappointed, extremely upset, and sort of downtrodden that this great idea they were really excited about got destroyed, and instead they had to do this lighthearted romp, which they weren't nearly as interested in. And interestingly enough, Ira Steven Behr also tells, even after this happened, that he gets a call from Patrick Stewart asking him to go to lunch. So he goes to lunch with Patrick Stewart, and they have a nice lunch. And then Patrick Stewart brings up, oh, I hear that you guys are considering that there's this idea to do an episode where Picard is has to face his fears of becoming an admiral, of growing old. And he told Ira Steven Behr, under no uncertain terms, I will not do that episode. It's not going to happen. Never going to do it. Just write me an episode where I get laid. And at this stage, that had already been decided. So Ira Steven Behr thought that was kind of like beating a dead horse or adding insult to injury or whatever. But yeah, that made it very clear that this original idea was not going to happen. Now, I also talked about in many other videos how Patrick Stewart was very infamous for saying that he wanted more. Now, I've heard this described several ways. Recently, I saw a thing that said sex and shooting. Another way I saw it described was effing and effing, fighting and fornicating, but the most common way, and the way I think that Patrick Stewart, call him Picard, that Patrick Stewart actually phrased it, just my guess, is fighting and fucking. That he was constantly complaining, and Patrick Stewart was said to be unhappy with season 3 overall because he thought Picard was not being centered in the show enough. Which is probably why they gave him 2 episodes in a row that focused on him, Allegiance and this one. Now, I had talked about this before where I completely disagree. I think Picard features in Season 3 very prominently, and I think he was just comparing himself to Kirk and how Kirk was the main focus of the entire show. And Next Generation would become a very different show that was more of an ensemble, and it would be that way even more so in later seasons, and that's why the show was so goddamn good. But as I said, I already talked about that in later episodes. But yeah, this episode would seem to be the direct result of Patrick Stewart wanting more effing and effing. And so you get this episode a lot of people compare to Indiana Jones or Romancing the Stone, and some people even said the Maltese Falcon, although I'm not familiar with that. The writers and producers love to compare it to classic movies, even though they probably more resemble more modern movies like Indiana Jones. They just don't want to seem like they're ripping off modern movies, but it's okay to be inspired by the classics. Anyway, so I think, and I've heard this opinion before, and I completely agree with it, that the original idea for this episode sounds way better than what they actually did do with this episode. But it is, when you think about it, it's clear that elements of that original idea were reused in the season 4 episode Future Imperfect, which is an episode I quite like. However, that episode was, of course, more Riker-centric, and wasn't really about Picard's fear of being an admiral or fear of growing old. That didn't cover it at all, but there were elements of, a holodeck where there was a future version where Riker was the captain and Picard was an admiral. So it was just those slight elements that we're taking into it. So, yeah, I think this idea sounded way better, and I think that would have been a better story, and I think Roddenberry and Patrick Stewart were wrong for quelling this idea, and I think there's a reason why, I often praise Michael Piller, and also Ira Steven Behr and Ronald D. Moore, also good writers, good character writers, and Michael Piller in particular is very good character writers, and I think if they were really excited for this original idea, which sounds like a good idea, I think it probably would have been far superior to what they did. This is like succumbing to pressure, not so much from the networks, but more directly to the Roddenberry box, which is, a lot of ideas have fell victim to the Roddenberry box. But, in fairness, and as I covered before in my channel, sometimes I agree with the Roddenberry box. There have been other examples where Roddenberry has crushed ideas, and I thought, I actually agree with him. I agree with his reasonings for wanting to crush ideas. I think there was an example in season 2, I can't remember what it was, but I thought the original idea was stupid. It was something Maurice Hurley had, and I thought Roddenberry was totally in the right for crushing that idea. And I think the episode The Bonding, I actually sided more with Roddenberry when he didn't like Ronald D. Moore's original idea for a kid moping in a holodeck, and the fact they made it about aliens, I think made the episode better, and so did Michael Piller. But in this case, I think Roddenberry is completely wrong. I think, and that the original idea did sound way better than this. Now, that being said, I didn't completely hate this episode. It was okay as far as I'm concerned. It was fine. It was a fun, lighthearted episode. But you know what? That idea Ira Steven Behr really originally had sounds much deeper, like a great character episode, like something, and a meaningful episode that's like powerful and one that you remember. But this was just, fluff. It was a little bit of fun in between the serious episodes, just something to pass the time, and something that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's necessary, and especially in long shows like this, where you have like 24, 25 episodes a season, to have a bit of fun in between, the serious pieces or whatever. But it's just disappointing that this could have been much more than that. So let me talk about Vosh. And I always, because the way her name's spelled, I always want to say Vash, but that's really, it sounds like that's more the American way of saying it. It almost sounds like Vosh would be the British way of saying it. But anyway, Vosh. Because, and this is another thing I've talked about a lot in my other videos, so if you've seen them, you're probably sick of hearing me talk about it. But I originally saw season 4 first, before, like, almost a full year before I saw season 3, and I saw it like each episode like 3 or 4 times before I saw any episode of season 3. And so this is yet another example where when I finally did see this episode, this was a prequel, because I had already seen Vosh and Cupid many times, and I knew who Vosh was. So this was the episode. Oh, so this is the episode where Picard meets Vosh. So this is where she comes from. And it's because it's interesting, because I've heard a lot of people complain that they feel like Vosh and Picard have no chemistry whatsoever, and that the two of their relationship seems very forced and dry, and there's no sort of chemistry between these two characters. And so when they have a romance, it feels contrived and out of place. And honestly, I never felt that way. And I do wonder if part of that had to do with the fact that I had already accepted that the two of them were a couple before I saw this episode. I already knew, oh, this is Vosh from Cupid, and I remember that she's made Marion, he was Robin Hood, and like he confessed her love to her, and this is the episode where they meet. So I didn't have to be sold on, oh, this is this new character that Picard's gonna fall in love with. This is a character I already know. Again, it's my fault for watching the damn show out of order, but you know, it was different in the 90s when you were at the mercy of syndication. But anyway, so maybe my opinion is colored by that introduction, but when I watched this episode and I tried to judge how the chemistry is between these two characters, and I honestly think they do have chemistry. I don't know. That's just me. I think that the chemistry does work between these characters, because I think I like the way they portray Vosh. I think she's very smartly written, very well acted, because she comes off as a mischievous character who is a shady character who, you know, is up to no good, but she has this light-hearted element to her character where she's obviously very attracted to Picard, and I think the writing and the acting completely sells this to me, makes it very plausible and believable that she would be attracted to Picard. And so they have this sort of light banter, and again on Picard's part, the way at first he's very sort of resistant towards her because of his whole like being annoyed that he just wants to be left alone when women keep trying to constantly interrupt him and wanting to have sex with him, where he just wants to be left alone. I mean, we all know that, right? Am I right? Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Terrible joke. But anyway. But no, I totally buy Picard's reaction of slowly starting to get infatuated with her, coming from a place of how ridiculous and how outrageous, as he says, she is. I think that chemistry between them, like when she starts about the shit she steals and whatnot, he's just like, you are outrageous, like how could you do, like that sort of back and forth like relationship that they have, where he's just like chastising for being so, you know, risky and doing dangerous stuff without any consideration, or sort of less moral stuff, but she never crosses the line. So it's just in a way that you can tell that even though he's like arguing against her, that he does it, there's something intriguing about her to him. And again, as I said, this dynamic was already sold to me in Cupid. which I know came after this episode, but I had saw it many times before I saw this one. So by the time I saw this one, I was already sold on this dynamic, so I didn't have to be sold here. So I don't know if that makes a difference to those who watched it in the proper order and saw this episode first. But when I watched this episode, I am sold on this dynamic, and I think it really works. Yeah, and I think the actress who plays Vosh does a really good job. Now, I want to talk about the start of the episode where Picard is on the Enterprise and being grumpy and everyone's pushing him to go on vacation. Now, at first, when he comes back from this diplomatic mission that was success, and Riker congratulates him for it, and he's like, "Oh, congratulations, sir," and he's like, "For what?" He's like, on the success of the mission. He just goes and walks into the ready room. Now, I've heard some people say that this is first and second season Picard, and that they're kind of reverting in writing his character like the curmudgeon that he was in the first two seasons. And I would agree with this if not for the fact that the characters specifically call out this behavior as out of character for Picard, and they note that he's in a particular bad mood. In fact, they use this for the primary reason for shoving him on vacation, because they see that he's overworked and overstressed. Therefore, I think that argument is invalid, because season 1 and 2 Picard, this would be normal behavior. If he did this, like the whole thing, I'm thinking that whole bullshit in the Samaritan Snare when he came back from the surgery and everyone was applauding. He was like, "I beg your pardon." He was such a grumpy ass old curmudgeon in that episode, and I railed about that in that episode. But that was seen as normal behavior for him. They weren't questioning it. They weren't saying, "Oh, sir, you're too stressed out. You need to go on vacation." Not just that episode, by the way. Pretty much almost the entirety of season 1 and 2, especially season 1, he was being grumpy like that, and they never questioned it. Here, though, when he acts like that, and he is acting like season 1 and 2 Picard, but when he does, they immediately call him out on that and immediately say, "Oh, this is unusual. This is weird. He shouldn't be acting this way. Something must be wrong." Therefore, I completely disagree that they reverted in the writing. They actually used it as a device to show that he was overworked and overstressed. In fact, I really like the scenes when, Crusher, goes to him. I think there was a similar scene in the original series with McCoy and Kirk as well. I can't recall exactly, but it did seem reminiscent of that, where Crusher goes to Picard and is like, "Sir, I have a problem with one of the crew members. He's refusing to, he's overworked, he's overstressed, and he's not listening to advice, and his performance is suffering." And Picard, what I like about this scene, and what I think differentiates it from the Kirk-McCoy thing, which I can't remember exactly when this happened, but in the Kirk-McCoy thing, McCoy, Kirk's like, "Oh yeah, let's get on this crew member. Who's doing this? I'll talk him to it." And McCoy's like, "His name is James Kirk." And Kirk's like, "Ugh," surprised and upset. But here, Picard catches on and knows immediately, maybe not immediately, but definitely not soon after, not too long after, he figures it out that Crusher's talking about him. He's like, "Oh yeah, well that sounds like a reasonable crew member to me." And I like that. I thought that was really cool. In fact, I really loved the whole character interactions, this whole opening stuff with sort of Riker trying to push Picard to go on vacation, and Crusher, pressuring him to, like when Riker's in the turbo lift, he was like, "Oh yeah, I have this perfect vacation spot for you," and Picard reads him. The riot act is like, "I don't want to hear any more of this. I'm not going on vacation. That's the end of it." Riker's like, "Absolutely." And as soon as he stops talking, he's like, "It's called right," and just continues like Picard never said anything. love that. And then especially love when they go up to the bridge and Troy's like, oh, says to Riker, oh, good news. When we get to the starbase, my mother's coming on board. And Captain, she's looking forward to seeing you in particular. And again, I like how Picard immediately catches on. He knows immediately that they're just like giving him shit because they want him to go on vacation. And he calls Riker into the ready room and was like, can I expect for the next 2 weeks continued harassment on not on being forced to go on vacation? Is the entire crew in on harassing me to go on vacation? And Riker's like, I'm sure there are 2 ensigns on Deck 29 who know nothing about that. In fact, there's a similar line on Deep Space Nine where I can't remember what it was. It was something, I think it was the episode Homecoming, where Kira wanted a runabout and everyone kept going to Cisco separately and saying, oh, I think you should give her the runabout. And eventually Cisco is like, what, does everyone on the station know about Kira wanting the runabout? And someone, I can't remember who it was, but someone's like, well, I think it was O'Brien. He's like, well, I doubt Quark knows anything about it. And Cisco's like, well then, as far as Quark's concerned, she's just going on a routine mission or whatever. I don't know, that's kind of an aside, but that scene did remind me of that when Riker was like, oh, there's 2 ensigns on Deck 29 who know nothing about it. But anyway, my point is, I love this interaction. I think this was very well written, and it shows the crew as a family. And this is what I think is important for this show. This is kind of, even though this isn't an essential show for Next Generation, not by a long shot, but it's an example of what the heart of the show is, and that is the family behind the characters. This is why the show was much better than the movies, because the movies couldn't really portray in a 2-hour span just the ensemble and the camaraderie and the sort of heart behind the relationship between these characters. And really, I think, honestly, I mean, there was a little bit in this in season 2, to be fair, but it definitely got way better in season 3 when Michael Piller took over, and it will continue to get even stronger as the show goes on. And it's just the easy camaraderie, the chemistry, the nice interactions, like the jokiness of this, I think is perfect. And I just like the feel of it. I think it really, really works. Now, then we have Max Grodenchik, or however you pronounce his name, who played Rom on Deep Space Nine, playing the Ferengi Sovak. Now, I've heard several reviewers say that this was the first time the Ferengi were portrayed in a comedic light, which is, I think, objectively not true, because The Price came out before this episode, and that was very clearly the first time the Ferengi were portrayed in a comedic light, because you had the whole thing with the guys going like, fine, have your Klingon servant bring me from some chairs. It's like, I'm chief of security. Then who brings the chairs? Like, that's obviously a comedic moment, and the Ferengi were played for kind of laughs and has goofy comedic vibes. Now, maybe, you could argue maybe there was even more so in this episode, but that doesn't change the fact that it's not the first episode, because Sovak was obviously sort of an idiot, and it was definitely played. He wasn't played as a serious threat, more kind of a lighthearted thing. And I do like the scene. Again, this is probably satisfying Patrick Stewart's demand for more effing and effing when Sovak was holding a phaser at Vash and Picard, and Vash throws her backpack. He's like, because he wants the disc, and Vash just throws it at him and goes, here you go, and Picard takes that moment to just grab the phaser from him, and he's like, oh fuck, and then Picard just punches him in the face. That was pretty cool. I think Sovak actually worked fairly well for this episode and served the purpose. And yeah, I mean, obviously I like Max Gernczyk better as Rom, but I think this was a good start for him. Definitely way better than the start Armin Shimmerman had in The Last Outpost, where he rightfully apologized for doing such a bad job with the Ferengi. Now, and to be fair, it wasn't his fault. It was more the director's fault, but I've already been over this. But anyway, then you have the storyline with the Toxu Tot and the Vorgons. And this is something, the Toxu Tot is something I remember from the Star Trek collectible card game. I talked about this in other videos I did. I used to play this card game a lot. And I remember the Toxu Tot was this rare artifact. And artifacts were harder to get in this game. But once you got it, you could play a supernova that would destroy an entire space location and would kill everyone there. And whatnot, but that's mainly what I remember it from. It was that game that actually, because just from watching this episode, I didn't really remember what the Toxu Tot was or what it did, because it's such a MacGuffin that's not really vital to the episode. It's not what the episode's about. The episode's about Picard going on an adventure with Vosh and having a little romance and having his holiday. Is this whole futuristic storyline with the Vorgons, like, I think a lot of people overlook it or forget about it. Like I didn't, because when people are talking about the time travel episodes of TNG, you usually go with time's arrow or cause and effect, or something like that, or all good things. Like, a lot of people don't think of this episode as and it's not really, it's just a side plot. I did mention it in the video I did about analyzing time travel in the Star Trek franchise, where I went through every single episode of the Star Trek franchise that featured time travel and declared whether or not I think it was type 1, type 2, or type 3 time travel. And just to go through this again, the type 1 time travel is whatever happened, the sort of 12 monkeys thing that you travel back in time and try to change something you can't because the past already happened and nothing you can do about it, and different variations of that. And then type 2 is the type that most fiction uses and most of Star Trek uses, where there's a singular timeline, you travel back in time, and you make an alteration in that singular timeline, you alter the future, now the future's different, and you have to fix what you did in order to save the one timeline. And then there's type 3 time travel, which is only used in Star Trek 2009, where if you go back in time and you make a change, it creates another timeline. Now you have two timelines, one with the altered timeline, one with the original timeline, which, as I said, is a much rarer in science fiction, and especially movies and TV. Maybe it's more common in books. But, Star Trek 2009, I think, is the only example of this being used in the Star Trek franchise, and that's very loosely in the Star Trek franchise. It's just a cash grab reboot nonsense. But anyway, that's an aside. Point is that this is type 1 time travel, and I pointed that out in this video, and it's one of the rare examples of type 1 time travel in Star Trek, because, as I said, Star Trek almost always uses type 2 time travel. That's the most common use in fiction, is by and large the most common use in Star Trek. And so whenever they do use type 1 time travel, it seems out of place, because it's not a good look to mix your time travel logics. Usually a show or movie has to choose one time travel logic and stick with it, because it doesn't make sense why in yesterday's Enterprise that was clearly type 2 time travel, and now all of a sudden we're using type 1 time travel. Like, in this universe, there should only be one type of time travel. And it is, you could say it's not necessarily type 1, but it is certainly presented that way, because the Horgons only went to this past in the first place because they read that Picard destroyed the device. And when did I say the Horgons? I meant the Vorgons. And when the Vorgons interfered with Picard and tried to steal the device, they ended up causing the very thing they were trying to prevent. Therefore, it was clearly type 1 time travel. Now, another thing that I heard, speaking of original versions of scripts that never got made, apparently originally the ending was supposed to end with the Vorgons traveling back to a couple days prior, and so towards the end of the episode they repeated like the second act of the episode because the Vorgons traveled back and changed it and tried to take the Toxu Tot, and I think it actually ended with them taking the Toxu Tot. But Michael Piller said that ending was too confusing, and that it would confuse the audience and they should just stick with what they have. In fact, they do a shout out to this ending because Picard says to Vosh, we might be doing this over again because the Vorgons are time travelers and they could travel back in time. We could be living this event all over again, which isn't really how that works. So that line never really made any sense. But it was I believe it was a shout out to that original ending. And you know what? I actually agree that that wouldn't have been a good ending. Now, there are shows, especially think of modern shows, that are able to integrate storylines like that into episodes. I'm thinking of the newest season of Loki as one example, but I'm sure there are many other examples of this, perhaps even in Star Trek, that I'm just not thinking of. But this is because the more modern shows have got more of a handle on time travel, and also audiences are more exposed and more used to time travel, especially than they were in the 90s. I have a feeling if they had tried to do it in this episode, it wouldn't have been handled very well, and it wouldn't make sense because then they would be mixing up the Type 1, Type 2 again, and and it would be kind of like that line where it didn't actually make any sense. So I'm glad they didn't do it. Even though I think storylines like this were handled a lot better in more modern shows, I don't think they would have had the experience to handle it correctly back in 1989. So I'm actually glad that they didn't do that. And as I said, and plus I think it's a better ending that those stupid Vorgons don't get the Toxu Tot. Because screw them. It would have been more frustrating if they actually did get it. And also, another thing I would point out is that I watched some reviews where people were unclear on whether or not the Vorgons were actually who they said they were, because they said they were kind of like time cops, like trying to restore the future and return the device to where it belongs. But then Vosh sort of accused them of being the criminals who were trying to steal the Toxu Tot in the first place and use it for their own nefarious purposes because it is a weapon that can destroy stars. And some people said that they were unclear on which of these cases was actually true, but I wasn't unclear. I thought they were pretty damn clear that the Vorgons were in fact the criminals who were trying to steal it in the first place and wanted to use it for nefarious purpose. I thought they made that super clear because because Vosh at first was like, hey, I'm familiar with the professor's notes, and he talked about two Vorgons, a male and a female, who were constantly trying to steal it in the first place. And Picard's like, okay, you're going to have to, prove that you are who you say they are. And their response to that was to, shoot them and, shoot this paralyzing weapon ray at Vosh that made her go like this. So I thought that made it super clear that they were the bad guys and that they were the criminals trying to steal it in the first place, and that's why Picard destroyed it. So I didn't find this unclear at all. I thought that was made super clear, but that's just me. Yeah. But as I said, this whole Toxu Tot thing wasn't really that. It did feel like tacked on and just kind of a MacGuffin just there for the sake of it. The whole point was really just Vosh meeting, having this little romance with Picard. But anyway, so now I would like to thank those that support me on Patreon. I'm very much appreciative towards everyone who has supported me. It does really help me continue with this channel. And yeah, I'm very thankful for everyone's support. So I'll just give a quick shout out to those that support me. So we have Tetson, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Managester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Migalacio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we do have a few patron comments on this episode. Let's see. Let me just see if I can find them. They should be around here somewhere. Here they are. Okay, just 1 second. All right, first comment is from Kyrie091, who says, Captain's Holiday, more like Napta's One Away. Wait, let me try again. Vosh, more like trash. Well, I suppose it was meant to be pronounced Vash. Vash, more like trash, but really they pronounce her name like Vosh. But either way, nice efforts there, Kyrie091. Anyway, well, actually, yeah, Napta's One Away is not too bad. I think that's better than the Vash one, to be honest. I think you got it right the first time. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, Captain Picard goes to a brothel planet and goes on an Indiana Jones adventure for 2 minutes. The end. My rating is 5 Horgons out of 10. I was watching your Revisited for Measure of a Man. I had an idea which would make this episode better with the structure of a court case. But before I mention it, I rated this and The Offspring 10 out of 10. Measure of a Man would be a low 10 and The Offspring would be a high 10. What if they used lore as an example on why Maddox is convinced that Data is considered property of Starfleet without rights or is a sentient being. I'm no lawyer, but this would at least have better grounds for a case than the one used in the episode. Riker does bring up lore in this episode. So this is more about Measure of a Man, which is all good. And what Steven's referring to is my main complaint about that episode is that I feel like the matter of Data being sentient or being not property of Starfleet had already been settled when he graduated Starfleet Academy. And so Steven's suggesting here, what if they used lore as an example of why his behavior and what happened with him as why Data should be considered property of Starfleet. And I don't think that changes anything. I think my complaints about the episode stand. I think the fact that lore was evil or whatever wouldn't change the fact that the matter of Data not being property had already been decided when they gave him a uniform and said he was an officer. So I'm sort of sticking by that. But since we're on the topic of The Measure of a Man, I will say that I recently got the Blu-rays and I saw the extended version of The Measure of Man for the first time recently. I know these Blu-rays came out like 8 or 7 years ago or something like that, but I just finally got around to getting them. And yeah, the extended version was really cool. It wasn't necessary, but I remember talking about that episode, how the Admiral was completely unnecessary in that episode, but they had more scenes with him in the extended version that made his inclusion in the episode make more sense. And they did have this scene with Maddox that I kind of liked and hated at the same time, because in part they showed like Maddox being addicted to Data and Worf like stood up like he was ready to kick Maddox's ass, and I liked that. I liked the portrayal of Worf like sticking up for Data, but on the other hand it did portray Maddox as an even worse two-dimensional mustache twirly villain, so that part of it irritated me. Anyway, thank you for your comment, Steven, but enough of Measure Man. But also, no, I got to talk about the Horgon. That's another thing I forgot, getting back to Captain's Holiday. This is another thing I forgot to mention was the Horgon. That's also another artifact that was in the card game, and this one was the most powerful artifact. It allowed you to take double turns. It was almost a cheat, like in later versions of the game, they had to disqualify this card and say that it was no longer valid because it was too powerful. And I remember playing this game, and whoever got the Horgon would basically win. Which doesn't make sense because this is something you just put out to show that you want your Maharon. So I don't know why the game would interpret as that you get double turns. I don't know what this game was trying to say in that. Anyway, but yes, I always remember the Horgon. Anyway, Horgon, get it? Horgon. Yeah, anyway, sorry. Next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, the best episode of Ryza is still, well, not a great one. Romancing the Stone, but a Ferengi instead of Danny DeVito, and Vosh being a compelling type of femme fatale for a bald man who'd rather be out in the sun, show off his bare chest, and catch up on his reading. 5 possible deceptive time travelers out of 10. Is this I suppose it would be fair to call this the best Ryza episode, but as Norman implies, that's not a high bar. But because you got Let He Who Was Without Sin, which is a terrible, terrible episode, and the Enterprise one was it 2 days and 2 nights, which I actually think that episode's not as bad as people say it is, but it's not great either. It's okay at best. So so it's easily the best Ryza episode. Can't remember if there was a modern Trek Ryza. Surely they must have went there in Lower Decks. So maybe I'm just not remembering. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, the episode where the Ferengi become a joke. If this is Patrick Stewart's idea of getting more sex in shooting, he should have said no to this dog of a script. Why does Picard go to Ryza in the first place? Only Worf is more out of place on a pleasure planet. Are there no privacy laws on Ryza? It seems wrong to me to just beam in from wherever without any credentials, ask for details about a guest. Oh yeah, anyone who beams down without any credentials can just go up and ask credentials about a guest, which is, fair. Why does Picard automatically trust the Vorgons? Picard and Vosh have no chemistry. And I feel sorry for Max Grodenchik, who is even stupider than Rom. That I agree with. The thing I find most unforgivable about this episode is that it spawned not 1, but 2 sequels. Sick face emoji. Vorgons, who cares? Avoid this episode and read a good book instead. 2 Ferengi and Hawaiian shirts out of 10. Ferengis and Hawaiian shirts. That's a good one. Yeah, I think Brandon's a bit harsh on this episode, and I've already talked about a few places that I kind of disagree, but that's fair. That's totally fair. I think I completely agree, though, with Max Grodenchik's character being even more stupid than Rom. I think that's absolutely true. You know what's interesting, though? I watched this video that explored from the example of comparing this to resort nations or resort islands in the Caribbean, and how a lot of the sex workers there are exploited or forced into sex work, and that is very sort of destructive and exploited for those because they don't really have that much of an economy or many other options other than to work in tourism, and particularly if you work in sex work, and how despicable it is, and kind of I don't know. Yeah, the rich and privileged sort of benefit off of that at the expense of those who are less fortunate, and how that Ryza kind of portrays that, where it's having these privileged Federation types go to this planet, and all the women natives there are constantly offering to have sex with them. Now, I think that's fair. I think that is a fair complaint to have, because it does, since they are portraying Ryza as being very similar to some of these resort towns and resort nations, and ignoring the issues with these resort nations. I think that is absolutely a fair thing to point out. But I also think that is clearly not the intention of those who write this episode, that they're intending it to be completely consensual and no one is sort of forced into a negative situation, that the culture of this planet is just has a different attitude and more accepting or casual attitude towards sex, which is something I can buy. And I do think that was the intention of the writers, but by the fact that they sort of use the imagery and the sort of association with known resort nations to conjure up this feeling, it does have, while ignoring the downsides to it, does sort of have a negative cost to it. And I think that was really interesting to sort of hear about that perspective. So anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So, my rating for Captain's Holiday out of 10, I think I'm going to give this episode a 7. Very good. Now, it's a week 7. I was tempted to give this episode a 6 because, it's very, as I said, it's very sort of inconsequential and lighthearted and silly, with Sovok being this enemy and then doing this Romance in the Stone side plot where nothing really happens. They just go to a cave, and it's your standard cave set that we've seen a billion times before, and they dig and whatever, and they don't find what it has, and Picard figures it out. There's not much of a plot to this episode, and as I said, the storyline with the Vorgons from the future was kind of really an aside and just tossed in there and not really explored, and just there's a MacGuffin that's not really the point of the episode. But I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and give it a 7 on the strength of the characters and the way that they jive and the chemistry between them. More so for the characters of the Enterprise and the sort of lighthearted, communal way, the family way that they behaved at the start of this episode when they're trying to shove Picard on vacation. I really like that. I think that went a long way to portraying the Enterprise as a community and the senior officers as a sort of family, and they sort of joke and jive with each other. And I honestly do think that Picard had chemistry with Vosh. I like their chemistry. I like their sort of romance. I think it was funny at times when Picard was trying to, just read a book and he kept getting harassed or whatever, and then Vosh sort of first introducing herself and them getting caught up and everything, and her lying and pretending she was totally legit, and Picard finding out that she's actually more shady. Like, all this stuff actually worked for me on a character level. It wasn't the funniest episode ever, and as I said, it wasn't the most interesting episode ever. I would much rather watch more meat and potatoes episode rather than this sort of silly side course. But as a silly episode, it's enjoyable. It's fun, something you can sort of watch and eat popcorn and while you're working out or doing something else, and just have a bit of light fun when you don't want to be too serious. And so it works in that regard. So I'm going to be very generous and give this episode a 7 out of 10. So that is it for my review of Captain's Holiday. So I'll just bring up my schedule here to see what's coming up next. If I can find it. Okay, where are we? Captain's Holiday. Okay, so this coming Monday, I will be doing my top 5 favorite albums, where I actually talk about music for a change and talk about the 5 albums that I personally like, just my personal taste that no one in the world would agree with this. But just if you're interested to what kind of music I listen to and which albums I consider masterpieces, then yeah, I go into that in that video. And then on Wednesday, I'll be back to TNG, don't you worry, to continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation with a review for Tin Man. And then Thursday, continue this with another new review for Hollow Pursuits. And then on Saturday, we'll be back over on my Patreon channel for a patron exclusive channel for those who support me on Patreon for the Most Toys Revisited, where I revisit my review for the Most Toys. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.